Welcome to Introduction to Educational Research. So this is the first presentation which aligns with week 1 of the course, where I kind of give you the overview of educational research, but also you can read that information in the textbook. This is the shortened version, and I'm thrilled to begin this journey with you as we really look at systematic inquiry and how that shapes what we do in practice, policy, and even educational theory. So whether you're pursuing your master's, which I believe you all are, or you are just interested in conducting research, this is kind of the first step. So this is going to lay the foundation for what we do throughout the semester. So let's start with the obvious, the fundamental question: what is educational research? What does that truly mean? Educational research is a systematic collection and analysis of evidence to understand educational phenomenon, solve problems in education, and improve our practice. It's how we move from kind of the anecdotal or observational information and intuition to evidence-based understanding. It's moving from your gut instinct to having data to support what it is that we know to be true once we collect that data and we analyze it. But educational research is unique. Unlike research in the natural sciences, in educational research, we're studying human behavior in complex social contexts. So I really want you to look at that sentence. Human behavior in complex social contexts. So, for instance, because my background is reading, I'm studying a student with a reading disability in a complex social situation. What is that complex social situation or context? That is the classroom. Maybe that's during intervention time. Maybe that's during Tier 2 in the MTSS or RTI process. So I want to break that sentence down for you because it's a lot of verbiage for something you already know. We're studying what people are doing in classrooms, in buildings. We're examining learning, teaching, motivation, development, and all the other countless factors that influence educational outcomes, because as a researcher, that's what you're looking for: educational outcomes and how we can improve what it is that we do. But here's the great part. Educational research happens everywhere. It happens in the classrooms. It happens in admin offices. It happens in policy centers. It happens in research laboratories. And it addresses questions like, how do students learn most effectively? What instructional strategies work best for diverse learners? How do educational policies impact student outcomes? What factors contribute to teacher effectiveness? How can we close achievement gaps? Those are just a couple examples of research questions that you might propose throughout the semester. Look at how those questions are phrased. How, what, how. So you can see that typically we're asking more open-ended questions because these are complex problems. And these complex questions that you have turn into research, turn into data. We then, after we collect that data, we analyze it and we present our findings. So starting to think like a researcher, asking complex questions, and I'm going to lead you through that process. So you might be asking yourself, you might be wondering, why should practitioners, that's what we are, we're teachers, we are in the classrooms doing the work, why should we engage with research? let me offer you some reasons, and I'm hoping I can convince you why this is so important that we do this as practitioners. So these are my 4 reasons. Let's see if I can convince you. First, research provides an evidence base for our decision making. So rather than relying solely on traditional or personal experience, or what we think or what he thinks or what my colleague next door thinks, research helps us make really informed choices about things like curriculum, instruction, policy. We need the evidence in order to make the best decisions we possibly can for our students, for our buildings, for our districts. That's my first reason. Reason number 2, research challenges assumptions. What do I mean? It's easy to believe something works because it's always been done that way, or because it feels right. Oh, we do it that way because that's how it's been done, or we think it works. Research really forces us to test those beliefs against the empirical evidence, against the data. So we're going to challenge some of those assumptions. My third reason, research empowers educators. When you understand research, you become a critical consumer of educational trends and fads. You can evaluate new programs, technologies, and methods with a discerning eye. So, everybody's using XYZ curriculum. Let's use something current like the science of reading. Everybody's using foundations in their classroom. Okay, well, now that you understand how to read the educational research, you can go back and look at that and say, okay, is systematic explicit phonics empirically best for students who are learning phonics, for all students, for diverse learners, for multi-language learners, for students with reading disabilities? You can now dissect that research and that information and be a better consumer of that research so that you can empower yourself, which in turn empowers your students. And then finally, my 4th reason is that research really drives improvement in schools and in classrooms. So if you think about the cycle of inquiry, of asking questions, gathering the evidence, analyzing the results, and applying your findings, that's like fundamental for continuous improvement in education, and that's the research cycle. So let me say that again. Asking questions, gathering evidence, analyzing the results, and applying the findings. That's the research cycle, and that's fundamental for continuous improvement in education. All right, so now let's analyze the research process itself. And we're going to look at specific approaches, how they vary, but generally they follow a certain format. So let me show you that format. There's a visual. But let's talk about each step, because I think this is a good way to look at it. So step 1 is you identify your problem, right? So research begins with a question or a problem. This might emerge from your practice, something that's been bothering you. I've been noticing kind of those ponderings that you have as an instructor. It might begin with a gap in the literature. I'm reading literature about different ways to use manipulatives in math, but I've noticed I haven't seen research on XYZ, or some sort of puzzle in theory that you want to unpack. The key is to identify something meaningful and something that you can research. For example, you might notice that students struggle with fractions despite traditional instruction. That might be something that you want to research. You're looking at all the best ways to teach fractions. You've noticed time and time again that your students continue to struggle. Why is that? That's what a good researcher says is why. And they start to examine the problem. Step 2 is to review the literature. Before conducting your research, you have to go and read what we already know. This serves multiple purposes. It helps you refine your questions. It reveals what methods others have used to examine this. It identifies theoretical frameworks, and it ensures you're contributing something new to the field, right? You're not repeating the same thing over and over again. You might be looking at it from a different angle. You might be examining it. Maybe all the work has been done with elementary school children. Now you're looking at this from a high school perspective. So books, journal articles, you're looking at the peer-reviewed literature that's already been done and what the studies are saying. Step 3 is formulating your research questions and your hypothesis. So based on the problem, based on the literature, you develop specific research questions. In quantitative research, you might also formulate a hypothesis, a testable prediction about relationships between variables. In qualitative research, you would not be developing a hypothesis, which we'll get into that later. Now, step 4 is where you design your study. Now, this is my wheelhouse. This is where you're going to make critical methodological decisions. That was harder for me to say than it should have been. So this is where you're choosing your methodology. So what research approach will you use? Who will participate? What data will be collected? How will you analyze that data? Each decision affects what you can learn and what you can claim. So let me give you an example. I recently examined, actually this wasn't recent, this is an older study, but I'm going to do a follow-up. Before COVID, I examined middle and high school students before ChatGPT. I was looking at, this is the height of Snapchat, I was looking at cheating behaviors. I used a case study, because a case study is you define the case, and these were adolescents. So that was middle and high schoolers. That's who was participating. What data did I collect? I did semi-structured interviews with them. They stayed anonymous. I promised them that they would be anonymous. And I collected interview data. And then I analyze it for themes. I can share that with you. So step 5 is collecting the data. I said in the previous slide, I conducted interviews. Doesn't matter how you collect the data as long as it is systematic and you do it in an ethical way. So when you're observing classrooms, you're surveying teachers, you're interviewing students, analyzing test scores, rigor and consistency matter, and there are certain steps you have to take. When we talk about ethics in research, one of the things you'll be doing is an IRB training, which is the Institutional Review Board, and it's called a CITI training, CITI, and that teaches you about ethical collection of data, how the data is collected, how it is stored, and how it is reported. But for step 5, it's collecting the data. How are you going to gather that information to answer your research questions? Step 6 is analyzing the data. So the analysis of your data is when you take the raw data and you put it into meaningful findings. So the raw data might be the interview transcripts, that might be the answers to the survey. But how you analyze that data depends on the approach that you use. And we haven't really talked about we haven't talked at all yet about approaches. You may have read about approaches or types of designs, but that will determine how you analyze your data, whether it's a case study, whether it's grounded theory, whether you're doing causal comparative, whether you're doing survey data. And then finally, step 7 is in interpreting and reporting your findings. So you interpret what the findings mean, you acknowledge your limitations, you share your results with relevant audiences, which in this course will be me and your colleagues. But research doesn't end in a filing cabinet or on your desktop. It should inform practice. It should inform policy. So you want it to be meaningful so that you can make a change. And it doesn't have to be earth-shattering change. It might be a small change in your own practice or in your colleague's practice. Or if you publish in a research journal, a larger audience of people in your field. So now it's time to look at the major methodologies that we use in research. We're not going to do every single one of them, but I am going to present both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. This is a visual you might like. Maybe you could even snap a picture or you can download it so that you have it. It shows qualitative and quantitative side by side, and you'll notice that qualitative answers why questions, and many times quantitative answers how many or how much questions. So I want you to think about that. Qualitative, typically your data are words, and quantitative, typically your data are numbers. So qualitative words, quantitative numbers. In qualitative, we use observations, symbols, words, etc. And you'll notice in the quantitative side, numbers, statistical results, which I stated. In qualitative, we observe and interpret. So the researcher has to be real careful with their biases, right? Because they are really part of the data analysis and qualitative research. In quantitative, it's a little more systematic in that you measure and you list things and you test. In qualitative, we are grouping certain data, certain phrases, certain words. We're not using a statistical analysis, where on the quantitative side, we are using a statistical analysis. So qualitative is more researcher involved. Quantitative, you're crunching numbers.
Qualitative, touch case C. Quantitative, 1, 2, 3. Qualitative, listen, smell. Quantitative, measure, well. Qualitative means you use your sense, that's right. Like hearing, taste, touch, smell, and sight. Quantitative means you use your tools, oh yes. We measure so you never have to guess. Qualitative, senses and tools. Quantitative, observation rules. One more time. Qualitative, touch case C. Quantitative, 1, 2, 3. Qualitative, listen, now. Quantitative, measure, well. Qualitative means you use your sense, that's right. Like hearing, taste, touch, smell, and sight. Quantitative means you use your tools, oh yes. We measure so you never have to guess. Quantitative, senses and tools. Quantitative, observation rules.
If you don't hear that in your sleep tonight, I'll be shocked. So we have qualitative, we have quantitative designs. We're going to look at the quantitative designs. On this visual, there are more than we're going to talk about. So if we were looking at this at the doctoral level when you were completing your dissertation, we would dissect each and every one of these. But I'm going to kind of do the major ones with you so that, when you do your homework, you can choose from the designs that I present. So the first quantitative design is experimental and quasi-experimental research. So these designs test causal relationships by manipulating variables and measuring effects. For instance, in a true experiment, participants are randomly assigned to treatment and control groups. Quasi-experiments lack random assignment, but still compare groups receiving different treatments. For example, you might randomly assign classrooms to use either a new math curriculum or a traditional one, then compare student achievement gains in each. So when you look at that definition, treatment and control group. So the treatment group is the group who receives the experimental curriculum in my example. The second quantitative design we're looking at is correlational research. This examines relationships between variables without manipulating anything. So, for instance, does class size correlate with student achievement? We're not messing with either side of that question, right? Class size is fixed. The student achievement, it is what it is. Does homework time relate to test scores? This type of research can suggest relationships, but it cannot establish causation. We don't know what may have caused that. Next is survey research. So surveys collect data from large samples. We use questionnaires or structured interviews. Most people use questionnaires when they're doing survey research. This is great for gathering information about attitudes, beliefs, practices, experiences. You know, there's kind of some unwritten rules about survey research. You need a large sample. Large sample, I guess, is relative. In the master's level, I would say 50 respondents, but the doctoral level would be 200 or more, right? Because the larger the sample, the more options you have for findings. You also have to make sure that they're not lengthy. We've all received surveys in the email, and we're like, I'm not doing this. This is going to take me 30 minutes to complete, right? So like 10 minutes and under is typically an unwritten rule. And you don't want to ask people to do open-endeds because they're not going to do them. Most people will leave those blank. So if you're depending on open-ended questions to bulk up your data, survey research probably is not the option for you. But you still get a lot of great information from it. What's nice now, if you do it in Google Forms or in SurveyMonkey, it'll make your pie charts and your bar graphs for you. So, we've come a long way in displaying the results. So, for what it's worth, we do like large samples for survey research. All right, so those were kind of the major quantitative designs. Now we're going to get into the qualitative research. So remember, we said quantitative is more numbers, qualitative is more word oriented. So let's look at what we have. So the first qualitative design is case study, which I mentioned earlier. I do a lot of case study work. Case studies can also have a quantitative component, but in this case, we're going to talk about pure case study research. And case studies provide an in-depth examination of something, of a problem, of a particular instance, whether it's a student, a classroom, a school, a program. They offer rich contextualized understanding. And it really, because you're looking at it so in depth, it kind of illuminates how complex the problem really is. But you're doing an in-depth examination of something. In case study research, we talk about that cases are bounded by something. So for instance, it might be bounded by time, place, um, context. But um, most of you have probably done case study work in your graduate courses where you're working with like one student or you're looking at one school. That would be a case study. The second type of qualitative is ethnographic research. So ethnography, that's really borrowed from, anthropology, where people would spend prolonged times in cultures. But in educational research, we still do ethnographies where we're spending a prolonged engagement in a setting, maybe that's a school or a classroom, to understand the culture, right? The culture of the school, the culture of teachers. We're looking at practices, we're examining perspectives. Maybe we spend months observing and participating in a school community. That would be an ethnography. There's some nuances when it comes to ethnography. We have something called the insider, and we have the edic and the emic perspective where, there's kind of a balancing act. If you're an insider, you have all the information, but you also have a lot of bias that comes with that. If you're an outsider, it's hard to get access and to get the truth, quote unquote, truth from people. So ethnographies are an interesting kind of spin for educational research. Um, but what kind of, when you're like, oh, I'm doing an ethnography, because you are spending a long time in a culture, and how you define culture, your study would help you define that. The next type of qualitative research we're looking at is phenomenology. And phenomenology looks at the lived experiences, and that should really be in bold. Lived experiences of the people who are living the phenomenon. For instance, first year teachers. What are their lived experiences? I just wrote a paper on the lived experiences of first year teachers. And that's a unique experience, right? We only get our first year once. So what have they been through? What have been their successes? What have been the obstacles? Um, and they all have that in common, right? But I'm getting their story about that phenomenon. I give you a couple examples. How do first generation college students experience academic transitions? What's it like to teach in a high poverty school might be another phenomenon. I mean, we could go on and on, but the lived experience piece is what's unique to this design. Next, we have grounded theory research, which is a qualitative design. And this methodology is developed from data rather than testing existing theory. So, this is an interesting, you probably won't do this in your 6140 class because it takes a long time to do. But the researcher collects and analyzes data at this together, and they're allowing a theory to evolve. So after examining the data, they then come up with a theory that they name, right? I can't even think of anything off the top of my head, but grounded theory is you're collecting the data first, you're coming up with the theory last. Unlike a lot of research, you're looking at theories that drive your study. And then the last qualitative design that I'm going to present to you is action research, which a lot of you will probably do at some point in your careers because it's practitioners who want to improve what they're doing in their classroom or in their practice. And even if you're not officially doing action research, I think you're always doing action research. You're always observing, collecting data, thinking, reading, trying to become better so that you're doing better for your students. So I think we're always doing action research, whether we're writing it up as a report or not. So my example here is teachers might study their own classrooms and they may gather data to understand problems or to test solutions. And I think that is something as a teacher that we naturally do. But what if you like both? What if you love the idea of collecting numbers but also collecting words and stories? Then mixed methods is for you, right? Mixed method intentionally combines qualitative and quantitative together to provide a more complex understanding. This approach or these approaches can be used sequentially or concurrently. So you could do survey and then interviews, or you could do those both at the same time. And they complement each other because each type of research has limitations. So this kind of complements and fleshes out those limitations. So if you want to do both, you're welcome to do both. But let's just kind of go back and review a little bit about that. So let's think about quantitative research. Those include tests, assessments, close-ended surveys, existing data like grades or standardized test scores, all of those numbers. And then let's flip that and look at qualitative methodology. Things like interviews. They can be structured or unstructured, which we will talk about eventually. Observations. Being in the field and collecting that rich, thick, rich data and information. Document analysis. That's qualitative in nature, where you're looking at maybe student work or institutional records or curriculum. Focus groups, right? Having 6 to 8 people and interviewing them at the same time, right? And they feed off of each other and they offer kind of a dynamic, that group dynamic and perspective that you don't get from a one-on-one interview. So at the end of the day, here's the thing. The key is to selecting a method that's going to align with your research question, and it's going to provide you data that is trustworthy, which we will get into eventually, talking about trustworthiness and validity and those sorts of things. But hopefully this was a nice overview of educational research. We didn't go over all the qualitative designs. We didn't go over all the quantitative designs, but we went over the major ones that you can think about as you work through this first week. So have a great day, and I look forward to speaking with you more about these topics.